Hello and welcome to Mastering Dungeons. And yes, I am not Shawn, but I do see that Graham is impersonating me, and that's fantastic. Welcome, Graham Ward. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing excellently. How are you, Teos?
Oh, I'm doing okay. A little bit of juggling going on, but isn't that always the case?
Always.
All right. Any recent news? Any weekend shenanigans? Any fun stuff going on?
So I live in a very small town, and so we take every opportunity to leave the town when we can, get a little bit of excitement in our lives. So we went to Durango, Colorado for the week, and I was there on spring break with my kids. Very high-profile vacation destination.
Is it?
Basically, not really. We got to eat sushi. We went swimming. You know, the things you do when your town doesn't have a swimming pool or sushi restaurants.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a great time.
It's great. And how old are the kids roughly?
My kids are 7 and 5 newly. They've just each had March birthdays. So.
That's fantastic. See, so that's the kind of thing. They don't need to know the wider Disney, that Disney exists or any of that stuff necessarily to have fun. It's good to start them, ease them in. I'm going to introduce my kids to the existence of these really exciting things now that they're in college.
Yeah. They'll learn all about things like swimming pools and sushi. Yeah.
Sushi. Yeah. So I tell you what else is interesting. I don't know. Shawn would have a great transition here. He recently got feedback of how someone was impressed about how does he plan his transitions. And I'm like, I don't think he does. And I certainly don't. But listener questions, we have them beginning with Victor Julio Hurtado via Bluesky, who says, do you think bringing back class roles would help new players better understand their place in the party? 5e has blurred the lines of what each class is supposed to do, especially with spellcasters like the wizard who can excel at almost everything. I saw a Reddit post where a newbie was struggling to define their sorcerer's role in the party. Someone responded, sounds like a big part of the issue is your poor spell choices, and then kind of rattled off like level 3, you got to take Ray of Frost and Web, and you're preventing everybody from getting close to your party. This is a great example of why class roles might be worth bringing back, or at least having a quick guide on what they are and how to make choices that align with them. With system mastery back in D&D and the lack of roles, it just makes it hard for new players, in my opinion. What do we think, Graham?
That's a great question. I played a lot of 4th edition, so I understand the function of player roles. I think it might be a little bit of an overstatement to say that 5e has brought back system mastery. And the reason I say that is that I think where it succeeds, 5th edition, I think, is trying to eliminate trap choices. And so where trap choices have been successfully kind of eliminated, you get the situation where, depending on playstyle of the group, any choice for character build, quote unquote, to use a phrase that I'm not a huge fan of, is sort of viable. And I think that this is a matter of taste, but that's just my take. You know, I think like if your playstyle is going to be narrative driven, then player roles might be too much game for your group because you want to be focused on the story. And whether you're doing an appropriate amount of damage per round, to me, you know, that may not matter to most groups. It may matter to most groups. But either way, if you kind of embrace one style too much, you end up cutting off part of the spectrum, and you keep the system from being flexible. So that's my take. I think like this is a great thing that a GM could provide to the players if the game is.
I love it. Yeah, I think like 5th edition, the easiest one might be the defender, right? Where like that role, it came with marking. It came with things like I'm going to jump right to my target that tried to move away from me, or I, push it to the ground or whatever, like super enforcing that idea of like, no, you are here on me. Some 5th edition things have that, like you'll take a disadvantage if you attack somebody other than me, right? We see that a little bit. But I kind of agree with you. I think that the designers didn't want and didn't think it was necessary to have these roles so ironclad in the initial design, and that's probably still how they feel. And I guess like I really like roles. I particularly like them for monsters, but I like them because of, as with monsters, the behind the scenes kind of thing. That when you are constructing your character and thinking about the role they'll play, or deciding what character to choose, I like them then, like you want to deal damage or you want to control. but I don't think any class demands that of the play.
And in some ways we live in this post 2014 era where any class could be any role. So is there a useful way to divide them? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but it's an interesting angle if it were to try to explore that. So yeah, I think that what D&D, the way 5e is written, the designers would say, no, we actually don't want that because it's a step too far. But it's a neat area for somebody to explore and make like a popular, if they could make a popular add-on or something like that, as you were saying. Cool. Well, thank you for that question. Our next question is from Yunderland Games 1186 via YouTube. How do you encourage players not to rest after each encounter while not making it seem that each adventure is life or death if they do not act now?
Do you have this issue?
No, but I don't know. Like I have some secret powers. Like one of my well-known secret powers is that I can get players to attack every single monster on the map, even when they begin by going, "Hey, everybody attack this." And then moments later, all the hit points are equally distributed, all the damage is equally distributed to all monsters. And in that similar way, somehow I have subtle tricks that I do, and I'm not even aware of them, that kind of keep people going and help it go. What I don't have, by the way, is the secret trick to like make them follow a particular path, as I saw this last weekend. But yeah, so this is not a huge issue. What about for you?
Yeah, I've definitely had groups who were like asking to rest after every encounter. And I admit it's really frustrating for the GM when you just want them to care enough to keep going. And like the really unhelpful answer is to like help your players care. And I think the more the players care, they create their own sense of urgency. But lacking like a whole episode talking about how to make players care. I mean, personally, I would say don't be afraid to just say you can't rest right now. It's too dangerous. Or you could go a route where urgency isn't forced, but instead you kind of present choices so they can manage their time and let them decide. If they think it's dangerous to rest, they might introduce other risks, or they might lose out on opportunities that have a timeout of some kind. And that's all kind of in the narrative design. I think when you go that approach, the players then are kind of choosing whether they want to take the consequence for not resting. And that's ideal, I think.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. If you can get them to feel like if these are the kinds of things that in a campaign, if you just give a few situations like this, it'll probably, I think, it generally course corrects itself, right? So if early on you have like what you're talking about of you could rest, or you could continue on in case, it's going to impact something. And you, depending on what's been going on so far, you could give some examples, in case the threat, in case these mobs have a leader, whatever it is. And then if you actually show those effects, like, well, someone else was here, but they've left, you see that there was a boss here and they left. That from then on, right, will create that reminder. Remember that one time, and so then they'll worry about that. And so showing the passage of something having been there, of something that left, of something that moved on, time to set up an ambush, right? They realize that somebody's attacking their dungeon, and now they set up an ambush. You just do a few of those, and they'll know that resting is always a choice, always carries implications. The other thing is, I think, helping them to embrace that sense of challenge, if it's fun for them, right? That like, I think we can continue, can be a fun choice to like, I think we can make it, guys. Let's do one more, right? And that it'll be fun to see if you can, or how hard it is, becomes neat. And trying to see the other side of like, well, if we're always rested, we'll always win.
Yeah, I think the unspoken assumption in the question may be that combat is the real game, and that things happening outside of combat are just rest or cutscenes or filler. And obviously, my personal opinion is that has been exacerbated in 2024. I think it's harder for a DM to give structure and interest to non-combat parts of the game. Granted, I'm not saying it's impossible. I just think you have to be intentional about it. And so I think if you think about filling in the negative space between the encounters with stuff that's more interesting than just resting and getting your hit points back, maybe that's another solution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again,
cool.
not the most helpful answer, though, because you could do a whole episode talking about how to accomplish that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as you know, I'm running this Savage Worlds Deadlands game. And one of the interesting things is that they have this idea that when you're resting, particularly during traveling, should be a time to sort of share stories. And so I gave that a little bit of a try last time in a sort of soft way. But that's also something that, like if characters know that resting also comes with some effort. It's not just reset your values, but hey, you're going to share what you think about the current plots, and you're going to strategize, and maybe you're even going to do some activity, right? If you dig into like the Cubicle 7 product kind of things of like, oh, it's resting time, maybe you want to whittle something, whatever. That carries enough structure to it that they may only want to do that every now and then and sort of see it properly that way.
Yeah, I really like that approach. I think about like one of my favorite role-playing games of past eras that is no longer in print was Marvel Heroic Role-Playing.
Okay.
And in that, you had scenes defined as transition scenes or action scenes. And the transition scenes you would use to establish resources, gain information. You would obviously rest, but it was sort of like an active rest scene. And you'll see when we talk a little bit more about 100 Dungeons, I've taken a similar approach, which is basically just saying like, you're not just resting every time you're not in combat. You are actively engaged in adventuring, which prevents you from resting or getting the full benefits of rest.
Awesome.
Until you find like a safe, secure way to do it.
I like that. Yeah, and that reminds me to let folks know that we're going to, in our main segment, talk about 100 Dungeons, the RPG that you're working on. So folks should stay tuned for that. Our last question is by Andrew Bishkinsky via Bluesky, and he says, question about Living Greyhawk. Was that campaign disassociated from whatever Wizards of the Coast current releases were? What was that like? I came into D&D during a time when Adventurers League very much supported current releases and settings, so I can't imagine it any other way, which is, I really appreciate that part, because it's true. Like, whatever we have seen, it's like the only world we can imagine. And as strange as it seems, during Living Greyhawk, the campaign was very disassociated from whatever the current releases were at kind of all levels. So there was a lengthy review period before any new source book was approved for the campaign. So you can imagine like the latest, complete arcane book would come out, and you could not play with that stuff until the people who oversaw the campaign, who were more volunteers than not, went through it all and tagged everything. And they would tag it into lists of approved only if you find something in the campaign that unlocks this for you, or banned. And the banned and unlock categories were not small. Like, it was really big. And so that was like an impediment really to buying the book. And as I understand it from Shawn, there was a time when RPGA, the Wizards of the Coast leadership, sort of looked at actually one of the books, and the moment when it was approved, and sales rose during that time, right? Like, they had whatever their initial sales was, and then they went back up when they allowed them. So you can imagine that this kind of led to thinking at the company of, maybe let's shorten that and maybe even change the approach. And 4th edition changed it completely to where everything was allowed in play for Living Forgotten Realms. If it was in Dungeon Magazine, Dragon Magazine, a book, whatever, in an adventure, stapled to the back of it, you could use it. And there were a few campaigns like Dark Sun's Ashes of Athos where that was not true, and it really focused the experience, but the core campaign allowed everything. And then 5e took that as well, allowing everything, and the additional step of saying every season of Adventurers League is based on that year's adventure. So when Storm King is out, you have a Storm King season. When it's Tomb of Annihilation, that's the adventure that's out, you had a Tomb of Annihilation season. And that was kind of neat, because you got like 12 plus adventures that you could pick up if you're running that hardback, that you could pull quests from and additional storylines and so on. And any thoughts here, Graham?
Well, so I entered the world of playing outside of my immediate family during 4th edition. And so, yeah, what I saw lines up with what you're saying. I think eventually we're going to look back on the early 5th edition, 2014 to 2018 era of Adventurers League and really realize that there was kind of like I won't call it a golden age at the risk of being braided, but I think that there was something special happening because for whatever reason, Wizards of the Coast had been convinced, or maybe just the D&D team had been convinced that what was best for players was also best for the company. And man, that seems like it's the rarest of moments nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it carries some work, right? Because you've got to be reading those books and immediately coming up with what should the next campaign be. And so, there is work there, and that requires a budget, which is, I think, the toughest part is you have to pay somebody to do all that thinking. That's when the admins were not just sort of overseeing things or reviewing things or, answering questions, but they were digging into that material of whatever was being done in preparation for printing for the upcoming adventure to then decide what's the framework of it and hiring authors. And that is a huge amount of work, as any of them can communicate to and have even on our show. So I can see why they considered changing it, but I agree with you. It was a really sweet way to approach it. We'll see what the future holds. I mean, it always goes in cycles. So.
Yeah, and I don't know that much about Living Greyhawk other than having rubbed shoulders with a lot of people who worked on it, but I understand that a lot of the people who were involved then are involved again in the Legends of Greyhawk stuff that's coming out from Baldman Games, and I imagine there's going to be a similar sort of like thinking of it as a separate, curated, organized campaign as opposed to just sort of mission DLC, to use a video game analogy. So I'm interested to see what they do. I'm really excited about it. The stuff that David Christ has talked about prioritizing is all stuff that I think is really cool. So
and some of it depends on how focused your world is, right? It's not much of an issue with Greyhawk if someone shows up with whatever the latest book has, right? They show up with a Warforged or whatever, it's fine. When we ran Dark Sun, it was funny. There was one time like a dad and 2 kids showed up at a table, and one of them was playing like a diva cleric, and the other one was playing like something else that was also, like an Aasimar paladin or something, right? Like divine upon divine. And, the DM's like, what do you want me to do? And I'm like, you just run that table. I'll come, we'll come. One of us went up and said, like, hey, just so you know, like normally there's no divine, but have fun at the end of this game. Please consider like, using one of the pre-gens or changing up your character. Cause this is the concept, but the table rolled with it and, whatever. It was a bunch of kids having fun. So it was fine, but it was just really funny to be like the most divine of divine people at the Dark Sun table.
I dealt with similar stuff in the Dragonlance campaign for 5th edition. So I don't know. I think these problems probably never go away, but that's such a good way of handling it. You want to make sure the humans are having fun and taken care of first and foremost.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, with that, we are on to our news and commentary, starting with news that it was in my brain all week since this came out on March 18th, where Andy Collins reported he and another 29, I think a total of 30 developers from Wizards of the Coast Sigil team had been laid off. And we later heard that 3 team members remain behind. And Andy suggested the remaining team members would do their best to keep improving and iterating the experience. Perhaps bringing it into D&D Beyond as a sort of tool of some sort that can exist there and live on there. But it's pretty clear that this is nothing that will be actively maintained going forward. So whatever you saw in terms of functionality, if you had all these lists of, it'll be great when, we can imagine we're not going to see that. And maybe it'll get, used for sort of parts or inspiration brought into the maps tool. But I think the thing here, and there's a nice article from EN World by Christian Hoffer wondering about the end of Sigil and recounting various times when Sigil seemed to him like a project without clear goals or parameters. There was also a Rascal News article. Did you happen to read that one?
Yeah, I read the part that I could read without paying for it.
Yeah. So it is available for free if you put in the email, and I finally went and did that and read it. And it's interesting. It has a number of kind of shocking things, including a guess at how much money was spent and news from somebody who's supposed to be within Wizards talking about things, including infighting between teams and things like that. So I reached out to some folks I know, and I wasn't able to really back up the things in that article. In fact, sometimes it was contradictory to some of the things in that article. So, I'd say that if folks read it, maybe think about that as something that one person felt. But as in many of the stories that we cover on the show, there are other ways other people feel, and what is truth even within a company where you can have different people seeing things differently. That's just the way it goes. But there's no question that Sigil was always sort of trying to prove itself, and I think internally seemed to not always know what it was doing. There were a number of indications of trouble for me when I was at the summit and was asking, and I wasn't the only person, but we were asking why or how you're going to sell this, right? Was it cost us? And they really were they weren't saying like, oh, we'll have information later. They were saying, we don't know yet. You're spending a lot and you don't know what you're going to charge or what the model is. And I think that's always really important, because when you sell something, you need to be clear on the value proposition. And it's a two-way street. Or if I just give you something for free, it like kind of devalues it. But if I ask too much, then now you're expecting a ton. And so that dance is really important. And there's clearly a lot that was spent here, with 30 salaries that we can imagine were pretty high, being on the tech side of things. And we heard contrasting ideas over time for the virtual tabletop team of, this is all about D&D, or it's a level builder, or it's just a virtual tabletop, or it's a Steam store for everything that Hasbro sells, right? We will see Transformers and My Little Pony and all these other things on it. And there were big hints of that kind of thing. And to then just end up where the timeline kind of goes from that communication to, it is up for playtesting. Oh, look, it's released is unfortunate. Though I will say, if something isn't working, killing it with fire is sometimes the right call. And Hasbro is a company where they have been talking about cuts over and over and over again. And it could very well be that someone said, well, I could either lay off a bunch of people for other reasons, or we just cut this one project. And yes, that involves layoffs, but it is a project that doesn't seem to be doing what we wanted it to do. And that's just a huge salary or huge expenditure that just cut out, allowing us to focus on the rest. So that can be very much a smart thing to have done. What do you think, Graham?
Yeah, I don't know. I always try to think of these corporate business things from the human perspective. I'm not really a business-minded person. In fact, I'll try not to let how I've been radicalized to be anti-corporate creep too much into your podcast.
Oh, no,
but
I like it. I
think that leadership really they are holding people's not just livelihoods, but their family situations, their living situations in their hands. And when you don't do enough pre-work, you haven't thought through the ramifications of spending a huge amount of money on a project that you don't really know if it has an audience. You haven't figured out how you're going to make money off of it yet in detail. Things like that. To me, I don't want to sound too accusatory. I understand these things. Obviously, the devils come out in the details once you get into it. But I think that we have to take that responsibility for people's lives very seriously. And that's just the people that are working for you, not to mention the mission of your organization and health and all that stuff. So that's kind of I think it's a real shame for those people who thought they'd be continuing to work on this for, probably years, right?
Yeah, you would think so. And even Andy Collins, who broke the news of being laid off, he had been brought on in June of last year. So he probably feels like he's just ramping up when this happens. And he was brought in, interestingly, almost, as I understood, as sort of a rules guy, which was one of the things that worried me, was these pillars in place. And along the lines of what you would say, I would hope that, they know things we don't, right, internally. And so if this needed to be cut, cool, great. You had to, or not cool, but okay, you had to do it. But learn for the next time, right? And as you're saying, how to not end up here again. And if there were any angles where pillars are causing, having D&D Beyond, virtual tabletop team, which I would presume is now kind of closed down, but even those two remaining pillars, if they're not talking, that's a thing to work on today, right? To begin that so that everybody cares about each other, no matter what pillar you're a part of, and that there aren't these walls, and worse, that you're not bricklaying those walls by being a member of one of the teams or the other, right? That there aren't sides and there aren't silos, and that you're in fact rooting for that other team all the time because they're your fellows, right? And in this company, united by purpose. And so I hope that will, if anything, can be the legacy of Sigil is a change in that culture. And I hear both sides. I hear people say that there's some bad things, and I hear people say it's just great. But whatever it may be, there's always room for improvement to be working all as one team versus individual silos.
Yeah, there was probably an element of just like, from the beginning, most responses I heard to this were either, cool, I really like 3D VTT Unreal Engine stuff, and I'm excited about this, which, anecdotally was not as big as the group of people saying, is that really what I want out of a VTT? And like, I feel like that's market research that could have been done to determine whether this was viable.
I don't know. It's so many people will say use Roll20, but complain about its features. And it's hard to know what to do with that. If someone asked me to help facilitate some project around a virtual tabletop, I would look at that and go, wow, we need to be really careful because this is so confusing. And there are so many people that rate it that way that you would think if you could create a better tool, people would jump to it. But maybe that's not true, right? And it's so hard to say. People will say they want robust features. People will say they want Owlbear Rodeo and everything in between. And separating that group out is tough. And if you think of the whole pandemic, right? Understanding how many people want to play online or not. When I look at numbers, they seem to suggest that there was this rise in people playing online, and then that is backed off versus it being a clear, digital only world. But I'm not sure that I know what I'm saying when I say that, right? That's just from limited data, and it just shows how precarious it is. And I mean, MCDM's making a virtual tabletop, right? And that could make a lot of sense because of their particular game. But it also is a question of, how much does it cost to run it and all? And you have to ask those hard questions.
Well, I'm glad it's not my job.
Me too.
But, just wish the best for everyone who lost their job.
Slightly my job is that Forge of Foes is now available on Audible. I have issues about Audible as a platform, but if you want to listen to monster advice and you don't hate the Audible platform, you can get Lazy DM's Forge of Foes, a book I like it so much. It's just sitting in front of me. Oh, does Graham have it too?
I have it somewhere.
It's in a stack.
There it is.
It's the kind of book everybody keeps close at hand. Hey, thanks for the plug. So Colby Elliott did the audio of this and narrates us through Forge of Foes. He's also narrated other Sly Flourish books in the past. There is even a special recording where Mike and Scott and I, the authors of this fine book, chat about how it's been kind of a year past and what we think about Forge of Foes and different aspects of monsters and adapting monsters. So you can get that at audible.com by searching for Forge of Foes or the link in our show notes.
Love it.
Next up is the Blog of Holding, where we hear that monster vulnerability is bad. And Paul Hughes argues that the 2024 edition should have made changes to how vulnerability works. He looks at the history of things. So since 3E and 4E to 2024, and I guess the 3 monster manual had something like 50 monsters with vulnerabilities. 4E had 75, and then 5E goes down to 20. And he says that there are about a dozen that are CR1 or lower, like skeletons. If you think about their bludgeoning vulnerability, it's been time honored. Awakened shrubs with fire vulnerability. And then only 10 monsters of CR2 or higher have a vulnerability. And I remember even in 2014, I don't know if you had this experience, but I was like paging through and going like, really? Huh, not vulnerable. Huh. And
yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, it wasn't just me. And the reason is because vulnerability is such a big deal with double damage, and players can so often do it, right? It's not like in third edition where you had like a limited number of spell slots that could deal fire. You might have an at will that deals fire or cold or whatever. And so it's just way too easy to essentially have the hit points of your monster. So that frost giant is not vulnerable to fire, and that white dragon is not vulnerable to fire. So what Paul says is, he wishes that they had done the work to actually go to the core level and change what vulnerability means. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. His solutions, I think, are viable. I think the problem with vulnerability, similar to what you were just hinting, is an integrated problem with the system. Okay. I think that the proliferation of doing lots of damage types, the fact that spellcasters aren't running out of spell slots very often, which connects back to our question about rest. There's all kinds of reasons why it's easy to do the damage of the type you need. There's also feats that allow you to switch damage. There's all kinds of stuff. And I think that in our effort to make the sort of character building as like free form and flexible as possible, vulnerability just shoots up in terms of its efficacy. We'll see, 100 Dungeons has its own solution. It's very funny, like almost all of these questions and commentaries on the design are things that I've really spent a lot of time thinking about and discussing with people on the Mastering Dungeons Discord. I'm a big fan of vulnerability. I think it's a crying shame that there are only 10 monsters of CR2 or higher that are vulnerable. I think, personally, it also depends on play style. Like, if you want your fight to be like a give and take tactical struggle where the balance is fine-tuned, then vulnerability is a big problem. Yeah. But if you realize that the 2014 design goal was to make combat be a little bit more swingy, a little bit more surprising, and like okay if it ends quickly. Like a one-round combat, granted, you don't want every combat to be one round, but I think like I love the idea that the players know they're going up against, say, a troll, and say this troll, it has a vulnerability effect of some kind to fire. They prepare what they otherwise wouldn't normally allocate the resources towards and have fire at the ready. Maybe they each carry torches. Maybe the sorcerer switches out a spell, or the cleric switches out a spell so that they can deal fire damage. And then it's a big swing, and it's like a Pokemon battle where like it's super effective, and you see that health bar drain down fast. I think that's really fun. Yeah. But I also agree with Paul, like especially because Paul's coming from a more fine-tuned design approach, mathematical approach. I like his solutions of creating ride-on effects where you can sort of make bad things happen for the monster if you deal that damage and not necessarily just double.
Yeah, and we see some things. They're monsters where, if radiant damage is dealt, they can't hide anymore, or they can't use their blah, blah, blah power, or can't recharge that turn, that kind of thing. Yeah. I do. It is funny. And I'm not an optimizer that like just layers in rules in my brain. Like I feel like I read something like those feats that allow you to change your damage type, and I think of, for when the monster is vulnerable. Like I'm a kid and I don't know better. And then later I think about it, I'm like, wait, monsters are kind of never vulnerable to anything. So it's only when you're resistant to damage, or the monster has this resistance, that's when it matters, right? Where like you're like gonna have your damage, so now you get to do regular damage, which feels non-exciting as a feat or ability or power or whatever. And I actually, in looking at the Monster Manual 2024, I'm not sure whether resistances have gone up, but I was shocked by the number of monsters that are resistant. It's kind of like the opposite, which maybe is a way of keeping hit points down. That might be what Tom Dunn would say, is that actually, that's all incorporated into their overall hit point total. So I'd have to look at that. But it felt like too often, because it feels like kind of, if it's one thing if the monster is like, I don't know, a green dragon and resistant to poison, or even invulnerable, I'm okay with that, immune to it. But when it's like most undead, but not all, right? And that's where you just or you choose a spell that deals poison damage, and you just prepare yourself for being disappointed, right?
Yeah. Yeah, the irony is that it's probably more fun for a player to deal the damage and have it be doubled than to no longer have your damage resisted. So, like, if I were designing it, and hey, guess what? I am designing some monsters for right now for my system. Like, my preference would be that you give the monsters some more hit points, and then you allow interesting ways where preparation can take those hit points away fast.
Yeah, cool. Yep, dig it. Well, yeah, so it's a neat. I enjoyed this blog for that concept of looking at just one little aspect and how we might want something else of it, but we.
I think my favorite version of vulnerability was 4th edition, where it had an amount attached to it. So you were vulnerable 10 or you were vulnerable 20, and that was how much extra damage you took when you took damage of that type. Yeah. The problem is it's just complex. And I think it doesn't quite fit into at least the 2014 design ethos. Yeah. Who knows what the 2024 design ethos thinks? And I think that's a really valid point that, like, when you're using a thing that little, you're just sweeping it under the rug.
Yeah. I think it could have been nice combined with a like per turn kind of limit, right? So like if on your turn you trigger the vulnerability, it takes 5 or 10 or whatever it's set up to. I would have liked that, and I could see House ruling something like that potentially, just because it is a little more fun. It's that nice reward. Yeah, you knew to hit the frost giant with fire, and so you get a little kicker, a little extra something. Yeah.
Unless someone say that we're just saying experienced players should be able to do more damage, I think learning the vulnerability is the fun part.
That is fun too. Yeah, you're right. Yep. Up next is Keith Amon on convention air quality. Friend of the show and supporter, Keith Amon has an excellent blog post up called Clearing the Air. He shares his experiences measuring the air quality at various conventions, and I see Keith at these conventions. I know you do too. So you see him walking around with his monitor, which is kind of cool, and then he'll blog about them or post or share them on Mastodon and Bluesky. And it's neat to see those readings. Like, he'd be like, oh, at GameholeCon, the DM area is one of the highest. It's like, oh, I would have expected otherwise, but interesting. And he shares sort of things like Gen Con tends to have some very bad air quality readings and some of the PAX locations on the East Coast. Big Bad Con gets big good readings for air quality and the highest marks for masking and vaccination. And Keith's point is great. I'm going to quote here. In our notoriously precarious industry, self-employed writers, designers, artists, and artisans can't afford to get sick. We can't afford to lose time to recovery, and we really can't afford the risk of long-term disability. Even if we're able to work while we're sick, the quality of our work is going to be much lower, and every gig we apply for depends in large part on how we did on the last gig we got. So all of us in the TTRPG community owe it to one another, to ourselves, and to creators of the games and game accessories we love to take care of one another. And that's kind of neat because while he does share his full review of various conventions he goes to, he shares the gear he uses to both stay safe and measure air quality. But more important than that is where he calls on the industry to take this seriously for those reasons. For convention organizers to require their facilities to provide good air quality, and for attendees to demand this of the conventions where they attend. Thoughts, Graham?
Yeah, I aspire to the level of not fastidiousness, but really intentional, detail-oriented analysis that Keith brings to every single thing that he does. I just respect him so much. And,
I know.
I think that we really should care. And so thank you, Keith, for caring.
Yeah. It's great. I mean, when I go to PAX West or Emerald City Comic Con in this new Seattle building that they've built, the Summit, it has huge areas, right? The floor to ceiling is enormous, and you can just feel and hear the air handlers pulling air out to make up for all those people that are there. And it makes you feel a lot better knowing that that's taking place. And it doesn't matter if you're at the basement or you're at the top. Those air handlers are just working away doing that because it was built during the pandemic, right? So it's fantastic. And I always feel really good being there. I still mask, but I feel a lot better about being there. This next article, Dungeons, Dragons, and Housing Justice, was shared with us. Thank you. In Minneapolis, the Luminary Arts Center held Displace, a North Loop fantasy quest. This theatrical production used D&D style play and audience participation and improvisation, but did it all based on the true stories of people who have experienced homelessness in Minneapolis. And this organization, Avivo, has worked to help Minnesotans find housing stability since 1960 and help them through employment, recovery, economic advancement. And they launched in 2020 the Avivo Village, which provides tiny shelters for those experiencing homelessness. And working with other organizers, they created workshops to share experiences, give feedback on creative ideas around this play they were putting together. There were 5 cast members who were at the time unhoused or in shelters. And they said the goal of creating this production, which combined, D&D with these homeless stories, were to create, not to solve the problem, but to create the dialogue of recognizing the problem and humanizing people. There's a nice quote there from one of the organizers about, sadly in this day and era, we must humanize people who have had a difficult time, and that's needed today. There's no one solution. Solutions have to be sustainable, so you have to think about how they will stand up to time and budgets and all of that. So nice article in the Minneapolis magazine here. There's a link in our show notes, or go to mspmag.com. Next up, Graham, is our friend JT Evans on node-based design. And I know you listen to the show, so you've probably heard some of these parts. Have you seen this blog on GNOME Stew?
Yeah, JT's blogging is awesome. And GNOME Stew is always a great resource, partially thanks to him.
Yeah. Yeah, so he says that this is the last piece of his adventure design series, the 12th blog. And he talks about breaking up your story into distinct nodes, each representing a scene that will lead to other nodes. And he points out that this works really well when there's a powerful mystery element. He talks about like Knight's Back agents and the clue pyramid, how it's easier to start at the end and work your way down, when to be linear, when to be open. Do you use this kind of node-based design? Have you tried this?
Sometimes, I would say more rarely, but I did appreciate at the end he threw in the concept of floating your clues, which is what I tend to do. So I sort of, similar to the way the Sly Flourish lazy DM approach says to like keep secrets and clues on a list. I have like ideas that I want to communicate, and I just look for opportunities to do that throughout the adventure. And so I know that in order to get to the next phase of a mystery, for example, like the sort of rigid approach, not rigid, but the more organized approach is to key your clues into specific nodes and make sure that you've got coverage so that those nodes will lead to each other. But like I tend to like have the nodes as interesting places and then like kind of mix and match like a game of Clue what you might find there. Because I think I'm just a little more of an improv based GM, so that probably floats with my style. But I love the way JT writes too, because like some of these concepts are covered on other blogs. Like he references the Alexandrians node-based design articles, which can be a little hard to read sometimes. They're just very wordy and a little bit like they kind of like Justin Alexander's book. They go very dense very quickly. And JT does a really, really good job of like covering it in a way that's super accessible, gives you the information you need, and hopefully gets people thinking about it.
Yeah, it's something that I wish were a little more prevalent in actual adventure design. This idea of the clue can be here or there, or that it's less about that specific clue that's, under the pillow in the bedroom, and more about linking A and B, or even A to B or C or D, so that you can progress. And that's the fun of it. It's not that you found the pillow note, it's that you find the link between A and those other 4 options. That's the killer. And so with this, keep on talking about the home campaign, but when I'm running Deadlands, it's funny how, there are 62 or something locations in this town. And only some of them have these hardwired clues. Not always. I don't want to be too harsh, but a lot of them are sort of like, this person knows this thing. And it could be better from that approach of saying any number of these places can lead you in these things, and think about, here's the list of connections you want to make. And you can drop it in when it makes sense based on what the characters say, based on what's happening, and based on that particular NPC. That can redirect you. And yeah.
Yeah, I think the cool thing about nodes is that they support one another and dynamically, so that you can, like, the adventure is less brittle. Mysteries are so hard to write because if you write them in a way that assumes the choices the players will make, you end up creating an adventure that will break instantly if they make a choice that you didn't anticipate. Yeah. And so the nodes help you because you can say, oh, they didn't go to that location. I can either move the clue over, or I can use this other node that I've prepared to provide backup information or whatever. You sort of like make the adventure. The thing that's interesting is the things that they decide to visit and look at and investigate. And I just think mysteries are almost impossible to run successfully if you don't use that approach at some level.
Yeah. And it also helps towards something. This idea of spreading out those clues helps against something that happened from a show listener and member of my home campaign, the Mighty Jerd, who at the table said, guys, this is just a side quest. And I thought myself, no, there could be really important clues in that side quest. And so then we had fun with it for the rest of the night. In fact, one of my NPCs at one point said, I need to go because you guys are just a side quest for me and I need to get back to my main quest. And everybody laughed at that level of meta. So it's fun.
Love you, Jeff.
Yeah. And our creator coroner, an RPG's guide to surviving shipping, not shopping, shipping. Clayton Notestein, who is an Ennies judge, shared on their blog what they learned by receiving over 300 Ennies submissions, which I thought is such a fun, that's a great value, right? You have just received all of these things and seen how they look. And they said that, when they looked at, they'd open a box and it'd be like water damaged, or the product had clearly moved all over the place, or it was perfect. And so not all methods of shipping RPG products are sound. You really have to read this blog to see kind of everything that comes for it. But they do a really nice breakdown of the types of damage products see, which shipping methods work, and with an eye towards both hey, if you are, a company that has tons of money, here's what you can do. But also if you're on the cheap, here's what will work for you. And I thought that was pretty useful. So it's at explorersdesign.com, surviving-shipping. Any thoughts on this one, Graham?
Well, as someone who submitted something for the Ennies this year or last year, we just gave it to them at Gen Con, but not everyone can do that. So it's nice to have the options laid out.
Yeah, that is nice if you can do it. Yeah, it really varies. I mean, just the last thing I received, I was like, wow, this is so well packed. And then I read this and I was like, oh yeah, this is so related. But there have been some things that I get even from major companies that just, bash around and the corners are all bent and you're like, okay, well, that could have been better. Well, that was our news.